the remember the famous Ukrainian, spring, summer, fall counteroffensive. It made a few miles. It got like two villages, and then they were pushed back. It's a complete failure. They lost half their Bradley fighting vehicles, their Leopard Challenger tanks. Their air defenses are gone. There's nothing stopping the Russians from doing whatever they want. So that's a complete disaster. Now, so you say, well, how can you make that worse? U.S. policy has been completely misguided. Well, how can you make it worse? But leave it to the White House to come up with a way. Um, when the war started, we and NATO allies froze Russian assets, any assets we could get our hands on. So if their central bank reserves, Russian central bank reserves, were in Western banks, many of them were, those were frozen, and it's about $300 billion, mostly in U.S. Treasury securities. The entire reserve position was a little under 600 billion. Uh, Russia very intelligently put 25% of the reserves in gold. So they had about 150 metric tons of gold. No, they have 3,000 metric tons of gold, but it was about $150 billion of the $600 billion. So they get about 25% of the reserves in gold. We can't touch that. It's one of the attractions of gold. It's physical. It's not digital. So you just put it in a vault and keep an eye on it, but you can't freeze it in the banking system. But anyway, we have these $300 billion of U.S. Treasury securities, mostly in Europe. The amount in the United States is about 30 billion, but most of it's in Europe. It's in Deutsche Bank and Barclays and HSBC, UniCredit, UBS, and a few other banks. Now, what the United States wants to do, and we're actually passing legislation to authorize this, probably already authorized, but just to make it clear, is to seize the assets. And we've already frozen them. We've frozen them, meaning Russia can't sell them, can't collect the interest, can't transfer them, but they still belong to Russia. That's what freezing is. Now, what the government wants to do is seize them, confiscate them, basically, take them from Russia, steal them, in effect, and then use that money to rebuild Ukraine. Now, there are a number of problems with that. Number one, you're not going to be able to rebuild Ukraine because Russia will take over the whole country at the rate they're going. So there'll be nothing. Russia might want to rebuild it. The Ukrainians might, but the West is not going to rebuild Ukraine because the West is not going to be involved. That's how badly they're losing. But that aside, when you do that, that's a default on U.S. Treasury securities. I don't care what you call it. You can dress it up in legal language. I'm a lawyer, so I actually understand all this. But the rest of the world is going to look at that. And Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, China, South Korea, and other countries that have hundreds of billions, or in some cases, upwards of close to $1 trillion, in the case of China, of U.S. Treasury securities. They're going to say, hey, you just stole $300 billion, or 50% of the central bank of Russia's reserve position. This isn't like oligarch money, or something else where you might be able to rationalize it. What if they don't like what we do? What if they don't like one of our policies? So all these countries are going to be highly motivated to get out of U.S. dollars. You can't do it all at once. This will take time. And this, then I said this is all connected. This then ties into the rise of the BRICS currency. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They've been around. They've been meeting since 2006. At their last meeting in August, they added 5 new members. They added 5 new members. So now it's sort of the BRICS 10. But the members they added include Saudi Arabia and Iran. So now, if you look inside the BRICS, you've got Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia. I believe UAE was also added, United Arab Emirates and Abu Dhabi in particular. So now you don't need OPEC anymore. You have OPEC inside the BRICS. In fact, Russia has never been a member of OPEC, but now you have Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Russia all inside the BRICS. So they have as much power, probably more, than OPEC. And they're working on a new currency. And it's all designed to create, basically recreate the Bretton Woods institutions. We talked about that, but they have the new development bank in Shanghai, which is a clone of the World Bank. They have the conditional asset reserve. It's basically a clone of the IMF, swing lender for countries that are experiencing capital outflows. And they have a lot of other institutions as well. But now they're going to have their own currency. They're working on their own payments channels. So, and I've told people, the Treasury and the Fed, the Pentagon, I've had all those meetings at different times. I said, you are, and I said this years ago, I said, you're overusing sanctions. Sanctions can work against a medium-sized country that doesn't have many alternatives, but against a major power like Russia, they don't work at all. But by overusing them, you're going to drive countries away from the dollar and undermine the role of the dollar, first as a major global payments currency, and then ultimately as a reserve currency. I always got the meetings, but I pretty much got, I laughed out of the room. It was one Treasury official, David Dollar, interesting last name, but David Dollar was in charge of the dollar in terms of Treasury liaison with Asia. And he, like, at one meeting, I said pretty much what I just said. And he slammed his hands on the table. This was at the Pentagon, both palms down, bam, and said, the dollar has been the global reserve currency. It is the global reserve currency today, and it will always be the global reserve currency. And I said, David, I feel like I'm in Whitehall in 1913 listening to John Bull talk about how sterling is the global reserve currency and always will be. I said, that's not true. I said, it could be true if you manage it properly, but you're overusing sanctions. You're going to, and how many times you can hit the punching bag before the punching bag gets up and walks out of the room? And that's kind of where we are. So we've pretty much lost the war in Ukraine. We've lost the financial war that goes with it. Russia's doing extremely well. And Russia is a key part of the BRICS, and the BRICS are working together to create this new currency that will be linked to gold. It won't be a strict gold standard, but it will be the value of one BRIC unit. I don't know what they're going to call it. I call it a BRIC for now, but maybe they'll call it the Bancor. Who knows? But it will be its value will be determined by weight of gold, not a dollar equivalent. You can obviously, with the transitive law, convert that to dollars, but they'll let the dollar do the dirty work in the gold market, and they'll just peg to a quantity of gold. You don't even need that much gold to do it. You just say that's what it's worth. We issue it and we accept it. And so all that's happening around us, the White House is pretty much clueless. They don't understand this. I like Mike Johnson. He's the new Speaker of the House, but he seems to be on board this Russia confiscation. I've spoken to some people. They're going to try to take him aside and explain what a blunder that would be, but at least so far they're going ahead.
Very interesting comments, Jim. And before we move on to discuss the Middle East, I just want to stay on Ukraine for a bit. First of all, why did Russia attack Ukraine? What was it that they wanted? What was their objective?
Well, they've stated their objectives. It's not a mystery. They want a demilitarization, denazification, because it's run by a lot of Nazi sympathizers. Not join NATO, obviously, well, those were the three main objectives: demilitarization, denazification, no membership. Oh, and then neutrality. We have many examples of that. I mean, Finland was neutral throughout the entire Cold War until very recently. They just joined NATO, probably a mistake, but until then they had been neutral. Austria was neutral during most of the Cold War. That's why Vienna was such a hub for spies and like the third man or the Orson Welles. But Austria was technically neutral. They ultimately westernized. But so there is Switzerland maintains neutrality. So there's plenty of precedent for that, and they wanted Ukraine to be neutral. Now, why did they attack when they did the SMO, or Special Military Operation? The United States provoked the war. The United States spent 14 years poking a stick in Russia's eye, and Russia eventually reacted. But you go back to George W. Bush, 2008, the Bucharest Declaration. He said Ukraine and Georgia should join NATO, that we should start the process of letting Ukraine and Georgia join NATO. 4 months later, Putin invaded Georgia. You're not paying attention. You said that you want them in NATO. Putin says, no, and they did invade Georgia, and they took half the country and neutralized it. And Georgia obviously does not belong to NATO. So then flash forward to 2014. CIA and MI6 provoked one of these color revolutions. I forget what color it was, might have been purple, but there was the Maidan Square demonstration. Now, bear in mind, at the time, Ukraine had a duly elected president. They had an election, and it was fair by all accounts. And he was pro-Russian, fair to say, but he was talking to the EU. He was trying to do a trade deal with the EU, also doing a trade deal with Russia, tilting to Russia, but trying to play it down the middle. Ukraine politics is a tough game, but the CIA and the and MI6 and the local neo Nazis staged a coup, and they drove him out, and they killed a lot of innocent civilians in Maidan Square. And then it was President Poroshenko got on a plane and flew to Moscow, kind of had to run for his life. And then we installed a puppet. So a couple of months after that, Putin took over Crimea. So like what part of invasion do you not understand? I mean, and that was every time the United States and really the Europeans are vassals at this point. Every time the U.S. and its vassals provoke Russia, either by saying Georgia and Ukraine should join NATO or staging a coup and sending the president, kind of running for his life, Putin would react by invading. He invaded Georgia and he invaded Ukraine. Crimea, which is now part of Russia, historically part of Russia, but it was considered part of Ukraine. And we kept going. We kept going. I mean, they impeached Donald Trump for a phone call. A phone call with Zelensky, and he gets impeached. Now you got Lindsey Graham and Nikki Haley and Joe Biden, all the other warmongers going to Kiev. They don't get impeached, but somehow Trump makes one phone call, and that was enough to impeach him. So that was just the warmonger element, the State Department. And now Tony Blinken. The National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, Victoria Nuland, Deputy Secretary of State. They're the inner core, the warmongers, but there are plenty of them in Washington. No shortage. They just want war. They don't understand Russia. They don't understand history. They had this notion that if we can just keep pushing, provoke a war, we can deplete Russia's military capability, inflict major casualties on Russia, create dissension in Moscow. The Russians just, they don't train. They just sit there and drink vodka. The generals are incompetent. The whole thing will fall apart. There'll be an uprising of Western elites in Moscow, and they'll overthrow Putin, and we can get back to looting the place. None of that happened. None of that happened. They completely misunderstood basically everything about Russia. Putin's power base is not the oligarchs. He actually doesn't like the oligarchs. He has to put up with them. And he's told them, you can keep your money, but keep out of politics. And he put a few of them in jail, just as to prove his point. But he's never relied on the oligarchs. Putin's base is the military, the intelligence community, the Orthodox Church, and everyday Russians. And that has not been impacted at all. Their economy is doing fine. Guess whose arsenals are depleted? Not Russia, ours. We're the ones running out of Patriots. We're the ones running out of 155 millimeter shells. We're the ones who can't make the cruise missiles fast enough. We're the ones who don't have enough drones, et cetera. Russia has all of that and more because they put their economy on a war footing. Putin's more popular than ever. He's going to win re-election as president next month. And so they got everything wrong, which means that they are ideologically driven, they're not good students of history. They don't understand the Russian way of war. Just study the Battle of Kursk. Study what happened on the Eastern Front in World War II. The Wehrmacht went in and they killed 5 million Russians. And they were on the outskirts of Moscow. They invaded Stalingrad. They had Leningrad, today St. Petersburg, surrounded, and they were starving them out. And it looked like very close to a complete victory. But what they didn't understand is that, they killed 5 million Russians, but then the Russians said 5 million more and 5 million more, meaning Russia had reserves and what's called strategic depth and population. And all of a sudden the Wehrmacht, they suffered 5 million casualties, but they were done. They didn't have Germany is a much smaller country. They didn't have 5 million more, and then Russia went all the way to Berlin. But that didn't happen overnight. That took 2.5 years. And in those 2.5 years, the Russian strategy was kind of an envelopment. They would stop your advance, but they would kind of fight a war of attrition, but they would surround you in the meantime. And only when they had pretty much annihilated you and surrounded you would they go in and basically kill everybody. And then, maybe a few escaped to the west. But they did that over and over. And it took, like I said, it took 2.5 years. So anyone who studied that would have said, the Russians have, practically inexhaustible reserves, enormous industrial capacity, the discipline to go on a war footing, and they're very slow but very methodical, and they always win. That's what you would have concluded. The Victoria Newlands and Tony Blinkens of the world are intellectual lightweights. I mean, she went to Brown, but that's like a bachelor's degree, but she has no advanced training. Jake Sullivan's a campaign hack who ended up as national security advisor. He's just trying to keep the war going until the election's over. They don't have any strategic vision. So, I do look at the U.S. foreign policy establishment and I ask myself, and other countries ask themselves the same thing. I mean, where are the Henry Kissingers, the James Bakers, the Dean Rusks, the John Foster Dulleses, the Dean Achesons, George Shultz? I mean, where Averell Harriman, McGeorge Bundy? Where's that kind of talent and learning and brilliance? They made mistakes, but the point is there was never any shortage of talent there. And today we have all these hacks, but it shows up in the results. I mean, since Biden went in, we had a humiliating retreat from Afghanistan with a lot of Americans killed for no reason. We have a war in Ukraine that we're losing badly. We've depleted our arsenals. Now we have a war in Gaza, which is that's going to take a while, but the Houthis have closed the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, and now the Iranian proxies are killing Americans. So thank you, Joe. Nice job.
Jim, before we move to the Middle East, one more question on Ukraine. And it sounds like the only resolution is a complete takeover of Ukraine by Russia. And so my question to you is who's next?
No one. This is all Russia wanted. I mean, it sort of depends on how NATO reacts. Now, the U.S. has said they're going to give Ukraine F-16s. They haven't arrived yet, but that's supposed to happen later this year. They got to train the pilots. They have problems because the pilots don't speak English, a lot of them. But they still have to teach them English before they can teach them how to fly an F-16. There are all kinds of logistical difficulties with that. First of all, you need a 6,000-foot runway to fly an F-16. They don't have any in Ukraine. They've all been bombed. And if they tried building one, the Russians would bomb it. And so it's not even clear how you can station F-16s in Ukraine because they don't have the infrastructure to support them or maintain them or a long enough runway. So what do? Well, you could station them in Poland and fly them into Ukraine, but now Poland's at war with Ukraine. Now, in that scenario, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but in that scenario, Russia would probably bomb Poland. So when you say who's next, my answer is, well, it depends on what the other guy does. Russia's not going to invade Poland for the fun of it. They're not on some spree to take over even Eastern Europe, let alone Central Europe. But if Poland is dumb enough to allow their country to be used as a base for attacking Russians in Ukraine, they should expect retaliation. And so it's really, and the real concern, I mean, what I look at, I spend a lot of time thinking about is the escalatory dynamic. One raises the ante, the other one goes higher, then higher and higher. And the next thing, that's how you get to nuclear war. I mean, I've been studying nuclear war fighting since the 1960s. And there are a lot of great analysts, Herman Kahn and Paul Nitze and Albert and Roberta Wolfstetter, Henry Kissinger, and others. And they had different approaches and different emphases, but they all said the same thing in the end, which is don't go there, meaning nobody wakes up and says, oh, nice day for nuclear war, I think I'll fire a missile. That's not how it happens. It happens through escalation and the escalation dynamic continues to a point where one side feels that they're in a corner and it's existential and they have no choice. And what's interesting in that situation is this is where the game theoretic analysis comes in. If the other guy's backed into a corner and ready to launch nuclear weapons, it's a good idea for you to shoot first. And the first strike always has the advantage in those situations, even though you've got to potentially face a second strike. But particularly if your first strike can be extremely damaging to the second strike capability of the target. So you actually
Okay. First of all, both things are correct. People are under the impression that it doesn't actually matter, and that is modern monetary theory. And my friend Stephanie Kelton,
yes,
she's the big brain, professor at SUNY Stony Brook, I believe that's her campus.
She's the only person, by the way, that won't do a real conversation with me. Even Laser Eyes Mike Saylor did one.
Yeah.
I mean,
fair
I wonder
enough.
why.
Yeah. I've invited her. I've met her. I know her. I've invited her to, we'll have a debate. So I can find a host. We get a studio somewhere. She won't do it. But I recommend her book, The Deficit Myth.
Yep.
Every single thing in that book is wrong, but you should read it to understand how they think.
Yeah,
it's like, I used to read Pravda during the Cold War, and people say, well, Jim, why do you read it? It's all lies. I go, that's why I read it. Because you want to know what your enemy's lying about, because that's what matters to them.
Yes.
There's an inferential thing that you can do there. So read that book. It's all wrong, but it's an encyclopedia of all the wrong thinking. By the way, she's the big brain of this, and there's a Bard College, I think, has a think tank on this. But she was the advisor to Bernie Sanders when he was head of the Senate Banking Committee. The Budget Committee. So when the Democrats had the majority in the Senate, Bernie Sanders ran the budget, and she was his advisor and an advisor to his 2016 campaign. I'm not sure I don't know what she was doing in 2020. But the point is, she goes way back. She has a Hill career and just to an academic career. And actually, her inspiration was Warren Mosler.
Mm-hmm.
You may know Adams founder Mosler, but
Weird dude.
Yeah, well, I used to bump into him in the St. Croix because I lived down there for a couple of years. But he was running for a non-voting congressman from St. Croix, so I used to listen to his commercials on the way to work. But I'll spare everyone the story. Warren got his kids to do chores by paying them in his business cards, printed money, in other words. And he said, then when you accumulate these business cards, you can, and if you want like an allowance or something, you can come to me with however many business cards, and I'll redeem them for a certain amount, and then you can go to the movies or whatever you do. And I guess Stephanie was like a house guest, and she saw this and goes, aha, you can print as many business cards as you want. Mm-hmm. And then she just kind of took it from there. But I doubt there are more than 2 or 3 members of Congress who can say modern monetary theory, but they're all practicing it.
Yes.
It has taken over the mindset in Washington. Hey, look at Japan. Their debt to GDP is 300%. We got a long way to go.
I mean, she is so. I still follow her on Twitter now. I'm going to get blocked, but whatever. I have other ways to get the information. But she's so cocky right now about this.
Oh yeah.
Because they got to do it without asking for congressional approval for it.
Right.
I mean, it's like Janet Yellen is like she's nobody's idiot when it comes to we can talk about that word,
yeah.
But she's nobody's idiot when it comes to understanding full well what she was doing.
Right.
With this QRA, MMT.
Yeah.
Again, 24% of jobs
Yeah. Well, Janet Yellen
were government jobs.
Yeah, Janet Yellen is the downside of affirmative action, but she's not stupid. She has a very high IQ, but she doesn't know what she's doing.
But she knows. She thinks they know what they're doing.
Oh yeah.
Like these numbers they came from that architecture.
Right. So let's get.
It wasn't voted on.
So going back to where you started, Keith, with the debt to GDP ratio, 125%. Okay, we're there for a lot of reasons, and both parties are in on it. But what does it actually mean? And that was the question you asked. And we know the answer to that. We've got decades of empirical. We know the answer, but they're just now asking the question. You're right. Oh, gee, is this a big number? And what I say is, 34 trillion is a big, scary number, but it means nothing unless you compare it to GDP, unless you look at the ratio. Because I say, if you owe $50,000 on a MasterCard, if you make $500,000, no big deal. You write a check. If you make $20,000, you're probably going broke. So you can't get any information out of the $50,000 balance, you have to say, how much money am I making relative to that balance? So now, getting back to debt to GDP, 34 trillion doesn't mean anything unless you put it in the context of GDP, which is how much you're making. In other words, what's your economy actually worth? And now Carmen Reinhart, who's the chief economist at the World Bank, and Ken Rogoff is a full professor at Harvard, and Carmen was at Harvard and University of Maryland before she went to the World Bank. They wrote the book, This Time Is Different, great book. But they've done a ton of empirical research coming out in their papers. I recommend reading, the book's good, but I recommend reading their papers.
This Time Is Different by Reinhart?
Yeah, Reinhart.
Because it shows you hundreds of years of deficits and debts and what
and
the outcomes became.
Right, and they've done a lot more since the book came out, and they've sliced it every which way. Developed economies only, developing economies only, last 10 years, last 100 years. So they've sliced it, and they always get the same result, which is the following. I know this is going to upset a lot of people, but I'm going to mention the word Keynesian multiplier. There is such a thing as a Keynesian multiplier. It's not a free lunch, but it is true that at certain levels of debt to GDP, and I'll take 30% as by the way, when Ronald Reagan was sworn in, it was 30%. It was actually, we took it down from 120 to 30 in the 35 years from the end of World War II to Reagan being sworn in. And that was bipartisan. That was Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. It was never a partisan issue. It was like, let's just get this under control. But at those levels, assuming you don't just burn the money, there is a Keynesian multiplier, and so you can borrow $1, spend $1, and get $1.25 of GDP. That actually works. Whether it was money well spent, separate issue. Whether it's sustainable, separate issue. But you can borrow $1, spend $1, get $1.25. But the problem is there are diminishing marginal returns. As the debt to GDP ratio goes up, that multiplier goes down. So what's the critical threshold, as a physicist would say, even from complexity theory? Where is the point at which it becomes less than $1? So now you borrow $1, you spend $1, but you get 90 cents of GDP. Where's that point? The best answer is right around 90% debt to GDP. That's why the Maastricht Treaty that governs EU fiscal policy was set at 60%. Angela Merkel thought that was way too high, but it was a good cushion to 90. They kind of knew about the 90, at least intuitively. And
Reinhart
Rogoff proved it, but that was their 60 is way too high because you're getting too close to 90. Well, we're at 125. I mean, who's at our lunch table? It's Lebanon, Italy, and Greece. Right? That's our crowd. So, but when you go past 90, it gets worse. In other words, that multiplier gets smaller and smaller. Yep. So in the fourth quarter of 2023, and I realize it's just one quarter, you need a longer time series, that number, and this is to your point, that number was 0.67. We borrowed $1, spent $1, and we got 67 cents of GDP. So to answer your question, do you get GDP? Yeah, we actually had a pretty good quarter of GDP, but we didn't get, but we borrowed more than we gained, which means if you're increasing the numerator by $1 and you're increasing the denominator by 67 cents, what's happening? Your debt to GDP ratio is getting worse. In other words, you can't borrow your way out of a debt crisis. And you can keep borrowing, you can keep spending, you can keep generating GDP, but the GDP gets less and less and less relative to the dollar you borrowed. The numerator gets bigger, the denominator gets bigger at a slower rate, which means the ratio is getting worse. And what's the other consequence of that? Slower growth. It doesn't mean the world comes to an end. It doesn't mean we default the next day. You get slower and slower growth, which is consistent with the depression thesis, punctuated by recessions, which we have along the way. And so then, just to wrap up, I happen to be a lawyer, so I'll do a summation. Reinhart and Rogoff asked the next question, well, what happens when you actually get into this situation? And they said one of three things. The first one is default. So that's the Argentina case. But that's because they can't print. They borrow in dollars and print pesos. They can't print dollars. So you just default.
Yep.
And you can set your watch by Argentina. Like every 8-9 years, they default. Okay, default is one. Second one, a little fancier dress is restructuring, which is what the IMF does. So you don't actually default, but this is what they did with Greece in 2015. Extend the maturities, lower the interest rate, change the terms, smooth it out a little bit, and do a refinancing and keep going. there is no reason for the United States to default because we can print the dollars. There are consequences, but we can print the dollars. There's no reason for the U.S. to conduct a restructuring because we can print the dollars. So we don't need to do any of that. It's usually, it's really for countries that borrow one currency and print another.
Exactly.
Doesn't work. We don't have to do that. So what's the third? Hyperinflation.
Exactly.
Then that's the American
Bingo.
way. That's the American way.
It's an amazing thing. I mean, you do have at the household, I mean, let's just put it on the table. 2/3 of Americans have no money, no savings left. So when we're really talking about the economy, back to your point about the averages,
Right.
if you're Mr. Average guy, you're average. You're not like a real stochastic modern day like bean counter. Like
Right.
you don't use machines. You love AI, but you don't want to use it. You know, you want to be a linear, like kind of like a spy monkey.
Right.
Like you're just sitting there and you're doing that. But your rendition there of this time is different, and all of that empirical data that goes back as far as time does.
Correct.
Was awesome.
Yeah.
And what I did, like you always make me think on the fly. Somebody sent me this text. I'm going to show it right now. The other side of the trade, because of course you get GDP if you do two things, which they did. You understate inflation, the deflator. We don't have to get into that, but at 1.5%.
Right.
1.5. The number's 3, 4, 3, 5, maybe 4, 4, or 5. 1.5. So now GDP magically goes up because the deflator didn't go up that much.
Right.
And then on the other side, you borrow from your kid's future, and you hire a bunch of people with that. And they get jobs.
Yeah.
Right. And you just went through that. There's again Keynesian multiplier. Well done. So what I got this text. This is amazing. This is just trying to explain this to a 2-year-old or maybe a 10-year-old. Right. So and you can see it up here. So you take like lesson number 1. U.S. tax revenues at the top. Federal budget, new debt, national debt, recent budget cuts, etc. Now let's take out 8 zeros.
Yep.
8 zeros. And this is your family income is $21,700. Money the family spent, $38,000. New debt on the credit card, another $16,500. Outstanding balance on the credit card, $142,000.
Right.
Total budget cut so far, $38.50.
Right. So, okay.
It's like people can understand this. Now I don't know why there's no politician in America that doesn't run on that text that I got.
Well, I'll give you, by the way, great question, great point. I'll give you an answer. You understand it, I understand it, the text understands it, and I think a 9-year-old would understand it. I very little doubt about that.
ChatGPT definitely understands it.
Well, don't get me started. That's a whole
Yeah,
other,
it's a different rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's a whole other conversation. Not so sure. Just as a quick aside, I spoke to, I don't want to, it's not fair to disclose his name and I won't, but a mega cap tech CEO.
Yeah.
That was shortlist. And I said, yes, I'm trying to figure out the GPT thing. It looks to me like a speed reading plagiarist. And he said, you're right. He said, that's about it. I said, speed reading plagiarist? He goes, that's about what it is.
Yeah.
It was just a novelty kind of thing. But
I meant more like I take what I write,
right?
Because I write to Wall Street, which a 9 or 10-year-old can't really understand, and then I just tell it to, can you put this in 500 words or less? And to a 10-year-old, that works.
Yeah.
And I think that text works in terms of explaining
Right.
how upside down and what madness this budget and deficit has become.
Yeah, but you can do that because you are a genuine subject matter expert. So I think a subject matter expert using GPT for some output and then like proofreading it, tweak it, and send it out, that works. But if you have to be a subject matter expert to make sure the GPT output is okay, what about all the college kids? What about all the non-experts? What about all the everyday Americans who are using it, taking it at face value, and don't have the capacity to read it critically?
Yep.
That's the thing. I took a test where there were two. They went to GPT, and they went to a bright college student, I think a senior, and they asked him to write a 900-word essay on the war in Ukraine, causes of the war in Ukraine, the early stages or whatever, and they published them both anonymously. So you didn't know. So the test was, could you read them both and figure out which one was GPT? I read one sentence. One sentence said, that's the robot. And then I read the rest of it. I read the other essay. I had it on one sentence, and I was right. But it was because it was a cliche. But that's what GPT does. GPT, if you read 1 billion pages, certain things are going to jump out at you more often than not. They're called cliches or bad writing. But that's the training set, and the algorithms in the GPT are like, well, people say this a lot, so maybe that's what I ought to say. So when you find like a lot of cliches that almost don't work, but it was grammatical. It was grammatical. It was spelled correct. All that stuff was good, but it's like, this is really bad writing, and you actually, you actually have to be a really good writer to write really badly without getting noticed. I don't know, it was like Hemingway's Torrance of Spring. But it was easy. It was easy to spot the robot. So put that aside. Back to the...
You have a book coming out on that. Which, by the way, I told the team we'd be done in an hour, so now, of course, we only have 3 minutes left. But you have a book
I have
on
a
the
book
subject
coming
matter.
out on, it's coming out in November. It's a little too soon. We've still got a working title, working on the cover art, and we don't have our Amazon landing page. We will by the summer, and
Cool.
I'll start banging the drum. But I've been immersed in it for over a year. I would just say two things for investors. AI is real. It's powerful. It's got a role. It's been around for a while, by the way, but it's going to have a potentially more powerful role. ChatGPT, it's a tool. It's a writing tool. It's like spell check, but it's not a lot more than that. It's a little bit of a gimmick. There's a lot less there than meets the eye. So for the hardware guys, you know, AMD, Intel, NVIDIA, yeah, they're going to do great. I don't have a view on whether their stocks are overvalued or not, but the companies are solid and their product is in demand. The software side of it, the providers, Microsoft, OpenAI, Facebook, YouTube, which is part of Google, and I'll include Google and a few others. I have one thing to say. They're the gatekeepers on the output of AI and GPT. They're writing the algorithms. They're writing the deep layered neural networks. They have got, these are the exact same people who have lied to us for 4 years. They lied about vaccines. They lied about masks. They lied about social distancing. They lied about the war in Ukraine. Sorry, Russia's rolling up the entire battlefront, and we don't have time to go through that, but they are. It's not a stalemate. Russia's on the move. They lied about certain aspects of 2020. They lied about everything, but now all of a sudden, they're the gatekeepers of the output of AI GPT. We're supposed to believe them?
Wow. Really good.
Yeah, and
No,
open.
not really. I didn't mean really good, like
It's
for
really, no,
society.
it's
really good
and
thought.
there's a lot more to it. But OpenAI, I was sort of giving them a pass because they're new, and I was hoping they would be better. It turns out they're not. One of their big benefactors, the money behind them, they've created a new misinformation filter for the 2024 election. As soon as I saw that, but that money was coming from Mackenzie Scott. So that's kind of all I needed to know.
Man, I mean, and you were going to finish before I got you going on AI on tying this back, like just real world, what a budget is.
I'll tie it back, which is the answer to the question, Jim. If you compare this to a family budget and do the math, whatever, take off 6 zeros, et cetera, this doesn't work. It's not sustainable. We're heading for a disaster, which we are. Sorry to talk fast, but which we are. Why doesn't the Congress get that? Why doesn't the Treasury get that? Why are they on board? Because modern monetary theory says the opposite. They would say, yeah, that's all true, but it doesn't matter.
Yep.
You can print as much as you want. I mean, Stephanie Kelton went so far. The reason I read her book is I like to get the exact quotes, not, infer things. She said, we don't even need the U.S. Treasury securities market. So the U.S. Treasury securities market exists as a favor to investors to give them a place to park their money. We don't actually need it. All we need to do is call the Fed, give them wire instructions to Lockheed Martin. She said this. Call the Fed, give them wire instructions to Lockheed Martin, send the money for however many F-35s. Why do you need a bond market to do that? The problem with
Sounds like she's traded a lot of markets.
well, the problem with MMT is that they pose questions like that, and most people are stymied. They're like, well, actually, what's wrong with that? Why couldn't you just send the money right to Lockheed Martin? But I'll give you the answer, and it goes back to Warren Moslow's kids and the business cards. Every model she uses is a closed system. We don't have a closed system, and these people, and I'll start with Stephanie, but there's a bunch of them. They know what they know. Here's what they don't know. They don't understand foreign exchange markets. They don't understand the Eurodollar market. They don't understand that there are a lot of ways to strike at the US dollar other than defaulting on the debt, which are exchange rates, inflation, some of the things we've been talking about. So that's the kind of the master class for the people who believe in MMT.
Yeah, and that's what you and I, we'll get plenty of things right and wrong. I mean, that's where we, in principle, principal line of analytical attack, agree.
Right.
Like, we don't start with the world being a closed system. We start with the opposite.
Right.
It's a constantly evolving, nonlinear, and dynamic ecosystem like everything else in the
Correct.
world. Right? And
Correct.
so to have an expectation that you can do all this and just say soft landing, no recession, et cetera,
Right.
and there's no other side of the trade, which I think we've concluded is higher inflation for longer than you think.
Correct.
Potentially much higher.
Right.
Then that's the answer.
And it all goes back to the great Mundell, because Mundell said that there are three variables: there's the exchange rate, the interest rate, and capital controls. You can pick any 2 out of 3, but you can't. The third one will come back to haunt you. You can't control all 3. You can control 2 out of 3. If you fix interest rates and close the capital account, your currency is going to get crushed. Or if you have free exchange rates and an open capital account, forget about interest rates. You're just going to follow the Fed. So he said you can have 2 out of 3, but not all 3. But that's why, to your point, it's not a closed system.
Mm-hmm. Well done. And looking forward to your thoughts. Again, whatever Jim thinks on AI, his books will make you think. That's the point, right?
Yeah.
All ChatGPT, people just want what they want. They're lazy, they want a shortcut, they want the answer fast, whether it's right or wrong. It's what I started with. It takes zero knowledge to believe.
Right.
Yeah. So believe me, we're going to think critically and analytically here. So thank you for joining Jim and I. And Jim, thank you very much.